Since the center had a history of collaborating on many of their projects over the years, it was already a built-in relationship. So we took over Spring-Fed Records, which is a documentary record label devoted to releasing older recordings, reissues, sometimes field recordings, home recordings that have never been commercially released, primarily devoted to the music of this immediate region, the Mid-South. We don't get too fussy about where the boundaries are. So a lot of music from Tennessee, but some music from Mississippi or Alabama and other places within the general Mid-South region. We do have one new release that is set to come out this coming Friday. The 15th is the official release date. It's a home recording of John Hartford and Howdy Forrester, made by John on his cassette Walkman recorder that he took with him everywhere. And it was made at home. Now these are tunes that Howdy learned chiefly from his great uncle Bob Cates, where he grew up in Hickman County. These are not the tunes that Howdy was playing every weekend on the Opry with Roy Acuff or with Bill Monroe. These are the traditional tunes of Hickman County, and the recording is just the two of them. It's just banjo and fiddle, a little bit of conversation, some of the history, and some funny anecdotes and so on between the tunes. We are also having a release party on Thursday, this coming Thursday evening, the 14th. It's at the Legion Hall in East Nashville on Gallatin Road, and it's featuring the fiddling of Jim Wood. Jim wrote the liner notes for the CD and did transcriptions of all the tunes, which are included in the booklet. Jim, of course, knew both Hartford and Howdy Forrester. Jim is from Hickman County, and Jim is an outstanding musician, as I'm sure many of you know. So he's got a whole lineup of special guests. The last email he sent out, I sent a text to my managing partner at Spring-Fed, John Fabke, and I said, I hope there's still room for the audience, given all the special guests that Jim has lined up. And it's going to be a really, really special show. We'll have copies of the CD there for sale and so on. They're going to play through all the tunes on the record and probably some more as well. Okay, commercial over. What I decided to...
One more
yeah.
commercial. You have a CD.
I do have a CD,
and you're not mentioning it, so I will. I put it up here to remind me.
And I did bring more copies of this. I released a CD in October with Matt Brown, fiddler extraordinaire, who's my buddy from Chicago, which is where I moved from in 2014. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Matt or Matt's work. This is an album we recorded in Nashville, working with Dave Cinco, who is an outstanding engineer, works with Sam Bush and Punch Brothers and all sorts of people, and us as well. I'm sure that when Sam Bush goes out, he says, yeah, my engineer is the guy who recorded Great Reish and Matt Brown. But this is just old-time fiddle and guitar duets. It's all instrumental, just those two instruments. And there's a great deal of variety on here, hoedowns, of course, but rags and blues and a beautiful waltz that hardly ever gets played by anybody else. And all sorts of neat stuff on here. We've been playing some shows around, and I hope we'll be here on February 19th. Well, Gretchen and I need to finalize the details.
We've been talking about February 19th.
February 19th,
is probably
yeah.
when we'll have the CD release party with Matt and Greg here. And I wanted to have that flyer in all your pamphlets, but there was not time to whip it up, and I've been emailing Matt. But and we want to get you guys. I would love the Center for Popular Music and the Fiddle and Pick and the Musical Heritage Center have a great communication of whatever is going on with all this history
Absolutely.
stuff. And that's
Absolutely.
My personal copy, so whenever you're done, I'll take it back.
But I do have more.
I love it.
If anybody's interested in purchasing a copy, $10, best party going. I've got several here. Okay, what I decided to talk to you about today is the American ballad tradition, which of course is a huge topic and much more that we can cover in 45 or 50 minutes. But I thought I would share with you a few historical contexts, talk a little bit about the scholarship of balladry as it's developed over many, many decades. And I brought in a few rare items from the center's collection related to ballad traditions to show you. I have a little bit of show and tell. And lots of listening examples as well. I'll play a couple of songs, and I've got a CD queued up with a number of recordings as well. Now, ballads, as many or most of you probably know, ballads are narrative songs. That's the fundamental distinction of the traditional folk ballad, is that it's a story song. The name itself is a little bit curious because ballad comes from the French ballade, from the Latin ballar, which means to dance. And we don't think of ballads, certainly not first and foremost, as dance music anymore. And of course, a lot of scholars have speculated about how in the world these narrative epic songs came to be associated, at least etymologically, with dance. And there are a couple of theories, nobody's 100% sure, but it seems to have been related to a tradition in medieval France and Spain in which narrative songs were performed in a rhythmically vigorous way and were danced to, which seems a little bit strange perhaps to our sensibilities today, even what we know about old-time music. But that tradition was thriving from what we could tell. Those kinds of pieces went by different designations. They weren't all called ballads or ballades, but there is that association. That seems to have been where it comes from. But by the time we really hone in on the ballad tradition and its ancestry that relates most directly to North America, and what I'm talking about, of course, is ballads in the British Isles. By the time we move to the British Isles around the 15th, 16th century and see the ballad tradition really kind of becoming something cohesive, it has lost that dance association that it took from the European continent. So ballads in the English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh tradition, ballads are narrative songs. They are almost always strophic in form, which is a term that some of you might know. It simply means that it's the same music, or nearly the same music, melody that is, from one verse to the next. So you just go back and repeat the same tune, which of course in a genre that exists in oral tradition, that's passed down and preserved through oral tradition, strophic is quite convenient, especially since some of these songs have, in some versions, upwards of 15 or 20 verses. So the same music for each verse is an easy way to attach music to a long text. Some of them have refrains, not a freestanding chorus. Now I'm talking about the early British and Scottish ballads now. Some of them have refrains in the form of a recurring final line. So maybe the last line of a 4-line verse, or maybe a 5th line that's added to a changing 4-line verse, is a refrain that's the same every time. I'm going to play you an example of one that has such a refrain. The idea of the chorus doesn't come along until the ballad is well rooted in America and starts to become commercialized. And even then we don't always have a chorus, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, the canon, that is the kind of core repertory of old ballads from the British Isles, particularly from England and Scotland, was established by an American literature professor named Francis Child. You've heard the phrase child ballads. That's where it comes from. Not kids' songs, it comes from Francis Child. He was a Harvard professor. In fact, he was the very first professor of English at Harvard, the first person to have that title, 1876, which, by the way, was around the same time that Harvard named its first professor of music, although that was not related to Child and the ballad interests at all, but just as an aside. That man's name was John Knowles Payne, and he was an American organist and symphonist. He was the first professor of music anywhere in the United States, the first to have that particular title. It was right around the same time during the Reconstruction era. But Child, who was a literature professor, started out rhetoric, and then he moved into literature. He edited volumes of British poetry, was a Chaucer scholar. He, around the time of his appointment in 1876, he began to grow very interested in the ballad tradition, which he saw as a kind of elevated folk poetry. He was not interested in the least in the music. He was not interested in the least in those ballads as they were existing as a living tradition here in North America. He was only interested in tracing the history of them as far back as he could in the British Isles. And ironically, he did this without ever going to England or Scotland. He did it all by library research and a lot of correspondence with people who had various archives in Europe. the result of his many, many years of work, and the final version wasn't fully published until after his death in 1892, but the ultimate result was a multi-volume work called the English and Scottish Popular Ballads. And there are 305 of them. And for a 5-volume work in the original edition, that doesn't sound like a very large number, especially since we know that there are lots and lots and lots more ballads than just those 305. But keep in mind that this was not a collection that was meant to be enjoyed or used by people at home. This was a scholarly collection. So each one of the ballads has at least 100 pages dedicated to it, documenting different versions and cross relations and all kinds of things. It's an intensely scholarly kind of work. But what it did was establish a canon, a core repertory, for better, for worse. And Child, for many, many years has been criticized for some of the subjective decisions he made about what to include and what to exclude. For example, ballads that he came across that had a kind of racy content, ribald content. He thought those didn't fit his conception of the elevated folk, a kind of a pure Anglo-Saxon culture, undisturbed by modernity and so on. That's what he was trying to construct. And so any of the ballads that didn't fit that conception, he excluded from his collection. He had various other reasons for excluding other ballads, but these are the 305. Oftentimes when you see them in a recording or a reference in some publication, something like Barbara Allen, which might well be the single most famous of all the Child ballads, most of you probably heard that, you'll see the title, Barbara Allen, parentheses, Child 84. That's a reference to, it's number 84 out of 305 in the collection. Now, a lot of the Child ballads, of course, made it with immigrants to North America. And when ballad collecting started in earnest here in North America in the early 20th century, a lot of that was fueled by Child and his legacy and his work. So when a ballad collector like Maud Karpeles or a ballad collector like Cecil Sharp, who actually came from England to do his work in, at least in part, in southern Appalachia, North Carolina primarily, if he discovered a musician who was still singing some version of a Child ballad, that was a special discovery for him. He wasn't only interested in Child ballads, to his credit, but when Cecil Sharp discovered a Child ballad alive and well here in the United States, he got particularly excited about that because of that canonic status that Child had conferred upon them. So I've got a couple of Child ballads that I want to play for you and talk a little bit more about. The first one is, this is a recording that probably none of you have heard. I'd be surprised if any of you have heard of it because it's not been commercially released, although one day we might do it on Spring Fed. We have a long list of things that we want to release. This is a recording of a ballad singer from Fentress County, Tennessee, Cumberland Plateau region, D. Hicks. Do you know about the Hicks family, Denise? Yeah, the Hicks family is very well known, particularly in that region and of course among Southern ballad aficionados. The Hicks family is a large family of ballad singers. They're still, Dee died in the 1980s, and he was sort of the patriarch of the 20th century version of the family. But his descendants are still singing ballads up in that region. There's also part of the Hicks clan that ended up in Watauga County, North Carolina, and some of those have been collected by ballad scholars as well. But most of the interactions with the Hicks family and the collecting and recording that's gone on was done by Bobby Fulcher, and some of you probably know Bobby, I'm sure you do. An extraordinarily important person in the documentation of Tennessee's folk culture, particularly its musical culture. And he got closer to the Hicks family than any other scholar. And so this is a recording that Bobby made in the late 1970s. I think it was 78, but I'm not 100% certain of that. We have this recording, along with many others, in the archive at the Center for Popular Music, primarily because Bobby was frequently swapping tapes with Charles Wolfe. And we have all the Charles Wolfe tapes. So when Charles passed away and his family donated all of those tapes to us, we ended up with a lot of stuff that came from Bobby. Maybe the original copies maybe the originals, or maybe they were copies that he had made. But in any case, this is a particular ballad called The Golden Trinity, or The Golden Vanity, or The Golden Willow Tree. These are some of the many variant names, and some of you have probably heard Americans singing this. This is a ballad that has been traced back by Child originally, and others have added to our knowledge, to the 17th century. And there's some evidence that the original story, which is a story about some intrigue on the high seas, has to do with Sir Walter Raleigh. Many of these ballads, of course, are associated with real historical events and real people that we know something about. Others are much, much murkier in terms of their origins and the stories that they tell. But this one seems to have been associated with the British Navy and with Sir Walter Raleigh from about 1630s. The earliest version I think Child was able to locate was from 1635 of this. But here it is as it exists in oral tradition in Fentress County, Tennessee. So that's track 1 on the CD, please.